If you occasionally watch shows on Netflix, you might have seen shows like Love on the Spectrum, She-Ra and the Princess of Power, or The Good Doctor. What do these have in common? They all represent autism in one way or another. In fact, much has been done for autism awareness in the recent years. But has it all been good? We're gonna find out! As a woman with Asperger's, I personally was both excited and disappointed about those shows. On one hand, they do provide characters I can relate to. On the other hand, though, they're also written through a neurotypical lens. What I mean is they're made from the point of view of a neurotypical person, and we never really see the world through the eyes of an autistic character. In this video, I want to figure out ways to do that, to show the world through autistic eyes. My focus will be on women with Asperger's, because that will allow me to draw from my own experiences. The goal is to create something relatable to fellow women on the spectrum, but also informative and interesting to neurotypicals. So, what is this Asperger's syndrome, and why am I so focused on women who have this condition? Asperger's is a developmental disability. It leads to difficulties with behavioral and social skills, and often changes the way an individual perceives the world. Common symptoms are hypersensitivity to sounds, lights, or smells, and a strong need for repetition and routine. Autistic people tend to be naturally good at pattern recognition and have a strong innate sense of good and bad, but we also often see the world only in black and white, figuratively speaking. Another common symptom is a special interest, a strong, all-consuming interest in one or more particular fields. A stereotypical interest would be trains. However, especially women on the spectrum tend to have rather girly interests. That's one of the reasons they often go unnoticed. It's not considered too strange for a girl to, for example, know all about makeup and organize her nail polish by brand name and color. Other common interests among girls could be gemstones or animals. Autism is a lifelong condition that is not contagious and not curable. It is, however, inheritable. It can occur in everybody regardless of ethnicity or gender. That has not always been known though. For a long time, Asperger autism has been thought of as a boys' disease. It's still about 4 times more common for boys to be diagnosed with it compared to girls. Women tend to hide their difficulties, and their symptoms tend to be written off as quirks. This leads to a lot of women being misdiagnosed. Getting diagnosed as a girl on the spectrum is a bumpy road, and it's hardly ever straightforward. That's why, in my opinion, it's especially important to represent women on the spectrum and to show how autism can occur in us. In this video, I'll be using the terms Asperger's, Level 1 Autism, and Autism interchangeably, but I'll quickly explain their exact meanings now to avoid confusion. Asperger's is the old term, coined by Hans Asperger, who discovered the condition. There are other terms for other kinds of autism, such as Kanders. Today, these categorizations are medically considered outdated. Instead, a level system has been introduced, ranging from Level 1, requiring support, to Level 3, requiring very substantial support. Since autism is a spectrum disorder, such a level system makes sense. However, a lot of people, including myself, have strongly resonated with the diagnosis of Asperger's and continue to use that term. With the definitions out of the way, I would like to have a look at what I should definitely avoid when making a film about autism. The first thing I want to talk about is stereotyping. This has been a big issue in The Rain Man from 1988. It can't be denied how much this movie did for autism awareness, but it also created very strong stereotypes that we still fight against today. Especially problematic are so-called harmful stereotypes. Those are inaccurate or disproportionate depictions of the disability. An example from a completely different field: the stereotype that all Asian people are good at maths is a harmful stereotype because it's just not true. It's very possible to accidentally reinforce harmful stereotypes despite having good intentions. That's why it's important to portray diversity and to include uncommon or difficult to portray aspects. What are some typical autism stereotypes? Well, I'm glad you asked! The idea that we're all very good at school. It's true that we generally have a high IQ, but many of us still don't do well at school. Often the issues are bullying, general social difficulties, or simply boredom or disinterest. The idea that we're all savants. A savant is somebody who has excellent skills in one particular field, like Dr. Sean Murphy and his diagnostic abilities, or BBC's Sherlock Holmes with his deductions. However, being autistic doesn't automatically make you a savant. Those special abilities are actually rather rare. The idea that Asperger autists don't need any support. Asperger's is often considered the high-functioning end of the spectrum. Unfortunately, that means that a lot of our daily struggles will often go unnoticed. The idea that Asperger means having no empathy. On the contrary, people with Asperger often have tremendous amounts of empathy to the point that it overwhelms us. We're just bad at processing and showing that. The idea that only boys can have autism. I already explained that this isn't true, but it would also count as a stereotype. You can see that some of these things may be true for some people. We shouldn't entirely stop showing autistic boys who are good at maths, for instance. It just shouldn't be shown as the one and only autistic trait. The next two things I want to talk about are often a result of stereotyping. First up, what is alienation? Alienation happens mostly when autism is used as a laughingstock, like Sheldon Cooper in The Big Bang Theory. In regards to that, I quickly want to point out that the showrunners never publicly announced Sheldon to be autistic. However, they are still responsible for writing him to behave in an autistic way and then using that as comic relief. Now, why is this a problem? It's because it creates a perceived gap between neurotypical and neurodiverse people, an us versus them kind of mindset, if you will. When it comes to representation, we shouldn't only point and laugh at the weird other people. We should also see the similarities between us. Of course, it's easy to make fun of autistic traits and get a few laughs out of the audience, but it's not worth the damage you're doing to the community. There are ways to write a funny story about or containing autism without using the disability as a laughingstock. And if that isn't a possibility for you, you might want to just not do comedy at all. Now, a special kind of alienation is called romanticization. This happens when any negative aspect of the disability is being ignored. Instead, it's being treated as a superpower. Any positive aspect of a character is attributed to the condition, and none of the bad parts are being shown. One example of this would be BBC's Sherlock, but The Good Doctor does it as well. These shows or films usually paint autism in a very bright light, to the point that it seems desirable even. It is not as common for autism as it is for other mental health issues such as depression, but it's still important to be mindful of its existence. Another approach at romanticization is what I like to call inspiration porn. These are typically stories that are written by neurotypical people for neurotypical people. Their goal is to create pity and to be quote-unquote inspiring. Common inspiration porn sounds like, he asked her to prom despite her condition. The only disability is a bad attitude. Or, her family left everything behind to help her graduate despite her condition. Often accompanied by uplifting pictures of conventionally beautiful people in wheelchairs. Obviously, I am not criticizing the idea of disabled people being able to reach their goals. To put it shortly, judging them as inspiration porn isn't about criticizing what happens in these depictions, but rather how they were put together, by whom, and how they are used and circulated. In these depictions, the disabled person is usually silent, sometimes not even informed their image is being used. The tone is infantilizing, and underlying questions of real accessibility and inclusion are papered over by a veneer of charity and moralizing. Now that we know what not to do, I would like to look at what we should do. I divided this into two sections. First, a collection of what to do instead of the harmful representation, and second are the goals that good representation should achieve. To counter stereotyping and the subsequent issues, the best thing to do is to portray diversity. Characters should be based on real-life people and experiences, not on stereotypes. Doing research and listening to autistic people will help with that. Instead of using the same old tropes to clarify that the character is autistic, you should experiment and find new ideas to depict things. Autistic people aren't that different from neurotypicals, and it should be a goal to point out the differences and the similarities alike. In the same vein, both the drawbacks and the advantages of the disability should be shown, not only one or the other. Lastly, inspiration porn is quite easily avoided. Instead of saying she won the competition because she's autistic, which is terrible, or she won the competition through hard work and dedication despite her autism, which is still bad, you could simply say she won the competition through her hard work and dedication, which sounds way better. Now finally, what should autism representation actually achieve? If you create representation, you'll always have two audiences that you need to consider. The people you're representing and the others. In this case, that's people with and without autism. People with autism should feel understood and get somebody they can relate to, and people without the condition should gain information and hopefully feel empathy and understanding towards us. In order to achieve understanding, I will need to explain how I perceive things, how my mind works, and what life is like for me. Empathy and relatability come from good character design and from pointing out similarities between autistic and neurotypical people. The short film Mind My Mind, for example, does a very good job at visualizing the thought processes going on in the autistic mind and explains why we might seem slow in social situations.
Hi.
Hi.
But what are you into besides work?
Oh.
There she is. If you ever want to get laid again, at least try to act like a normal person for once.
Would you like to have sex?
At the same time, it shows us a neurotypical character who is patient, understanding, and accepting.
Her name is Gwen. She studies chameleons.
He's not the most social one, but who cares?
That's me.
This is creating a good example for how to deal with loved ones on the spectrum. The representation feels very authentic, and it doesn't need to resort to stereotypes to get its point across. It shows the autism as something that's just part of how the protagonist Chris lives his life. The disability itself isn't the issue that needs to be overcome, it's the way other people and Chris himself treat it that causes problems. Very popular among recent representation is Entrapta, a character from She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. I picked Season 3, Episode 2 as an example for where we see how well the showrunners handled her character. It's a scene which has touched a lot of people, in which Entrapta talks about how imperfection is beautiful, and how making mistakes doesn't immediately mean that one is a failure.
Imperfection is what makes scientific experimentation possible. Imperfection is beautiful. At least to me. Stand here! And you're really way too obsessed with this whole failure thing. I mean, I'm a failure.
You are not a...
In the scene itself, we can hear that Entrapta speaks a little too loudly and doesn't have as much nuance and tone as neurotypical people would have. Her lack of understanding of personal space and her inability to see Hordak's annoyance are also telltale signs of autism. At the same time, she does show empathy and an understanding of Hordak's situation and of his way of expressing himself. And everything is always tying in with her special interest in First One's tech and experimentation. This is another great example of representation without having to resort to stereotypes. One last animated short that I want to take a look at is called Feeling My Way. It's from 1997 and it isn't about autism per se, but it has beautiful visual and sound design which I would consider an inspiration for an own production. The way animation interacts with live action, highlighting certain aspects and completely omitting others, is very interesting and has resonated with me a lot. This could be a very nice way to show how we perceive, associate, and think about things. This is where I will start gathering everything I have learned, read, and experienced so far. I will try to create a collection of ideas for how to portray autism in terms of storytelling, visuals, and sound design. The main issue with storytelling is that intuitively the resolution of the story will be to beat the villain, in this case the autism. Obviously that doesn't work because autism is a lifelong condition, and for a lot of people it's not even something they would want to get rid of. If I could change myself and get rid of the Asperger's, I honestly don't think I would, because I'm sure I'd lose part of my intelligence. Trying to make a conventionally good or exciting story could easily turn into inspiration porn. Oftentimes, things that autistic people struggle with aren't flashy or exciting, and they don't make for a good story. Sometimes our life's biggest issue isn't saving the world, defeating a supervillain, or finding a cure to an incurable disease. Sometimes our biggest problem is going to the grocery store or figuring out the best way to color code our collections. It could even be something as abstract as trying to figure out what normal even means and who we are. These are all issues that just can't be overcome in one big hero's journey, and depicting it that way would be quite harmful, as it would create this idea of once upon a time they got their life together and then they lived happily ever after, which just isn't how it happens in real life. So if the film should be about autism itself, one will have to be very careful about what kind of story they want to tell. A good idea would be to talk about the experience of getting diagnosed, as that's an important event for a lot of women with Asperger's. I'd imagine that a story of self-acceptance and getting over negative coping mechanisms would be beautiful to tell too. Another example could be the story of how a relative comes to terms with their loved one's condition. Something similar to this can be seen in Pixar's short film Float. These kinds of stories would most likely, but not necessarily, have a classic 3-act structure with an open ending. Another option is to tell a story that's not directly related to autism itself, and just has an autistic protagonist. Here, one will be much more free in how to tell the story and what to talk about. It could be an anecdote, a detail that the person remembers, a retelling of a trip to an amusement park from their perspective, or a classic action movie, anything really. The most important part of this is to make it personal and individual, especially in the visuals and the sound design. It doesn't have to be a linear storyline either, it can be just as jumbled and messy or as detailed and focused as the autistic brain remembers it. I have found a lot of those kinds of stories in Everyday Asperger's by Samantha Kraft from 2018. One very interesting approach that I encountered in several books, videos, and conversations with friends is that being autistic feels just like being an alien and trying to fit in with the humans. This could be a fun approach to a story, but I'm not sure how exactly one will pull it off, because portraying autistic people as aliens could be rather alienating, and it might negate efforts to point out our similarities. For the visuals, Feeling My Way, which I already mentioned, is a great inspiration to me. Generally, using a point of view perspective is a great way to show our way of perceiving the world. In an entirely animated environment, one might want to switch to an outside perspective at some points. That will help to show the difference between how neurotypical and autistic people see the world. However, point of view perspective isn't the only thing that's impressive about Hodgson's style. Things like seeing one thing particularly clearly while the rest of the background seems distant and muddy, or sound-triggering visuals and vice versa, are all very interesting techniques when it comes to portraying autism. I would like to imagine that with things looking like this during a conversation, neurotypicals might understand why autistic people aren't always able to pay attention. With this kind of style, you could also show how we see patterns everywhere, or how our thoughts get stuck in loops sometimes. Other visual aspects of autism are face blindness, a condition which makes it very hard for us to tell apart different faces, synesthesia, which allows people to, for example, see sounds, or hypersensitivity, especially for light. These could all be taken up visually. Animation would be an especially good media to show face blindness, as it would allow you to just draw every face identically. There are also YouTube videos that are meant to recreate the autistic experience that could be used as inspiration for how to go about hypersensitivity, or synesthesia for that matter.
Do this for Mum, but I don't know if I can.
Layla, stop tapping your head.
They don't like it, but it helps me feel calm. Here comes the invasion. Outer face smiling. Don't stare. Remember the 5 things.
Each one of these colored lights corresponds to a particular note, and the colors are always the same.
Trying to keep all the do's and don'ts in mind while writing an autistic girl can be an intimidating challenge, but it's important to do it properly. There are still many misconceptions about autism in general, and autistic girls in particular, that can be helped by proper representation. The biggest takeaway for myself is to be very careful to avoid stereotyping, as that is the most common mistake in any kind of representation and leads to a lot of different problems. Instead, it's better to take on the view of an individual. Autism affects everyone in very different ways, so a piece of representation may very well speak to some people, while other people will find it misleading and wrong. Quantity is the solution to counteract that. The more individual, completely different from each other autistic people we see in popular media, the more we will realize how diverse this condition is, and how the stereotypes just don't do it justice.